Hello. I quite accidentally started on a little series of talks on my favourite preacher. It became about because someone asked me a couple of months ago, who is your favourite preacher? Well, the first one that sprung to mind was Iron Morgan, and he was a lecturer at Bible College when I was a student in the late 60s, and he was an extraordinary preacher, always dynamic, always faith-inspiring, always an in-depth presentation that arrested your attention. Then I talked about Ian McPherson, who was a wonderfully silvery-tongued preacher, a wordsmith, but with a depth of spirituality and with a faith-inspiring ministry, a wonderful preacher. Then the third one I thought of was Bishop Jack Nichols, who was the Bishop of Sheffield, now retired Bishop of Sheffield. He was a wonderful preacher, never long, always brief, but always left you something so wonderful to take away. He was profoundly simple and simply profound. I never heard him dull or boring or pedestrian. He was always clear, authoritative, and biblical, and inspiring, always so. And often very humorous too, had the capacity to make you laugh. I was the prison chaplain in Doncaster at the time when Bishop Jack was the Bishop of Sheffield, and he was a fairly frequent visitor. He'd come in and talk to the men and preach in the chapel for me from time to time. There was one occasion when we had an exhibition of Dinah Raw Kendall's pictures, and he came to the opening service to be the preacher as the exhibition was launched. It was an extraordinary event with £100,000 of the pictures hanging in a prison chapel and the prisoners crowding in for this inaugural service and for the enjoyment of the exhibition for about 6 or 10 weeks, I think. Yeah, it was a wonderful time. And Bishop Jack preached at that opening service, and he picked on one of the pictures to present the gospel to the men. It was a picture of the Good Samaritan. In fact, Dinah presented the Good Samaritan. I've got the picture here in a book called Allegories of Heaven, a book of her pictures. And I don't know that you can see that, but there's a look of such desperate helplessness in the eyes of the man who is being beaten up and left for dead. And there's an infinite tenderness in the eyes of the Good Samaritan, looks upon him and sees to dressing his wounds and looks after him. You see the people rushing by, the fat lawyer with the big bottom and the skinny lawyer, whatever he was, the scribe, carrying his briefcase out there in front, rushing past on the opposite side of the road. And Bishop Jack picked up the message of this wonderful picture, and he used it for his sermon on that occasion, and gave the men something so wonderful to think about, to relate to latch upon, and it was a clear and wonderful demonstration, preaching of the gospel of Jesus Christ through that particular parable. Actually, he began on that occasion by saying to the people who were attending, the church was packed, the chapel was packed with prisoners and staff and visitors, and he said, we're going to begin with 2 minutes silence. And so we all sat in silence, thinking we were being particularly prayerful and reflective. And when he finished the silence, he said, we had that silence because Manchester United lost last night. And he was always an avid fan of Manchester United. And the men laughed uproariously, and he had them in the palm of his hands from that moment on as he presented the gospel using that picture. They were moved. If they could relate to what he was saying, they were touched by his message, and so beautifully illustrated by the picture that was hanging on the wall, which incidentally hangs permanently now in the chapel in Doncaster. We managed to buy that picture. The prison authorities rose to the occasion, and it now hangs permanently in the prison chapel. Well, Bishop Jack wrote the foreword for this book, And he talks about Dinah's paintings of the Gospels that brings the Gospels to life. They do so because to the artist, the Gospel is alive to her, and so she's able, through her painting, to make the Gospels alive to others. And in the final paragraph, he says, the most moving testimony which I have heard to Dinah's work comes from young prisoners at an exhibition of her work in the prison chapel. The testimony was not in words, but in awe-struck silence and in tears. I hope that you are so moved. Not in words, but in awe-struck silence and in tears. And I think it was not just the pictures themselves that touched the heart of the men on that occasion, although they certainly did, but I think it was also the words of the bishop as he presented the gospel with clarity, with care, and with love to this chapel full of prisoners. He is, I should say, a man from Lancashire, and has a strong, wonderful Lancashire accent, and he never seeks to posh it up or to play it down. He is a Lancashire man, and that comes across so beautifully in his preaching. Always profound, always short, always simple, always clear. I thank God for him and for his preaching ministry, Bishop Jack Nichols, the retired Bishop of Sheffield.